Hello class, this video is on chapter 4 of your textbook, Understanding Food. It's called Food Safety. This unit is going to be sort of a mini course on food safety. We're going to discuss the definition of foodborne illness, the differences between biological, chemical, radiological, and physical hazards that can affect our food, and we'll discuss causes and methods of prevention of foodborne illness. Now, the U.S. food supply is probably the safest in the world. And why is this? This is because federal and state regulations require a high level of vigilance at all levels of food production and distribution. So the CDC investigates causes of foodborne illnesses, and then the FDA and the USDA share responsibility for monitoring the food supply. And recently, a new concern has been food defense, and this would be protecting food against terrorism. So, the field of biosecurity aims to keep our food safe from any planned contamination, like that food terrorism. Yet, ultimately, people do still get sick. This is because the government can only inspect about 7,000 of our 150,000 food processing plants every year. So that means about 95% of them go uninspected. So foodborne illnesses are bacteria, molds, viruses, and parasites. The highest number of illnesses in the U.S. are caused by these three: Campylobacter, norovirus, and Salmonella, which we'll go into detail a little bit more about later in this unit. Symptoms include gastroenteritis, nausea, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, and vomiting, and the severity and seriousness of these symptoms and whether or not the illness may be deadly usually is based on who is affected. So the people that are most vulnerable to foodborne illnesses are the very young, old, or those with compromised immune systems, whether that's because they're on chemotherapy or they have HIV, etc. And most of these biological hazards can be inactivated or killed by adequate cooking. So the molds, bacteria, viruses, and parasites can usually be inactivated or killed by adequate cooking. So on the earlier slide, I mentioned that there are biological, chemical, physical, and radiological types of foodborne hazards. So this table breaks those down. So biological might be bacteria, molds, viruses, parasites, and prions, which are all explained in detail in your text. Chemical, plant toxins, animal toxins, agricultural chemicals, industrial chemicals, and physical hazards like glass, bone, metal, plastic. And this slide doesn't show radiological hazards. That might include something due to the food becoming radioactive from a nuclear power plant or weapons. So bacteria cause more than 90% of foodborne illnesses. They cause the most amount of foodborne illness of any of these types of foodborne hazards. It's funny though, because only about 4% of all identified bacteria in existence are pathogenic, meaning capable of causing disease. The remaining 96% are harmless, and some are actually helpful when we, use them to produce certain foods like yogurt, soy sauce, any fermented foods like pickles, sauerkraut, kombucha, etc. This all involves the use of beneficial bacteria to make foods, but those 4% that are harmless in terms of bacteria can cause foodborne illness. So bacteria in food typically can't be seen, that's why it's dangerous, but mold in food can sometimes be seen. They're sometimes visible, having a bloom on their affected foods. So molds cause illness because molds are basically a fungus, and molds produce what's called mycotoxins, just toxins produced by molds, and these toxins are what causes food intoxication. So let's talk about viruses next. Viruses differ from bacteria because a virus actually needs a living cell in order to multiply, whereas bacteria are alive all on their own. All foodborne viruses are transmitted via the oral fecal route, that is via contaminated feces to the mouth. So This may happen as they are passed from person to person or through carriers like flies, soiled diapers, water, or food. And the two most common viruses that cause foodborne illness are hepatitis A and norovirus. So parasites, similar to viruses, also need a host to survive. Parasitic infections in the US are rare, though. There's only actually fewer than 500 cases reported per year, and roundworms and protozoa are two of the most common parasitic infections. So lastly, in terms of biological threats, we have prions. These are infectious protein material that doesn't actually contain its own DNA or RNA, its own genetic material, but it can lead to disease by misfolding other proteins belonging to the host. So you've probably heard of mad cow disease, and prions are related to mad cow disease. So in the case of mad cow disease, prions travel up the spinal cord to the brain, where they then incorporate themselves into the brain. This causes a chain reaction that creates holes in the brain and the damaging effects of the disease, the deadly effects of the disease. So as we finish up talking about biological types of foodborne hazards, it's really important to note that pathogens are living microorganisms, and so they rapidly evolve. This means that new threats to health are appearing. In fact, some of the most common causes of foodborne illness, like norovirus, a virus that we talked about, were at one time not even recognized as pathogenic. So chemical hazards basically involve any chemical substance we might find in our food that could be hazardous to our health. And human error is usually the cause of these hazards, especially when they involve kitchen cleaning supplies, so something that happens in the kitchen. This also could include the agricultural and industrial chemicals like pesticides, pollutants, etc., that may end up in our food supply. Plants and animals actually produce their own toxins as well. For example, both fish and shellfish, they harbor toxins that would be unaffected by the heat from cooking and that can cause illness. Some examples of this are the Chigotera fish poisoning that you may have heard of. Many barracuda off of the coast of Florida were found to have the Chigotera toxin, and because of this, it resulted in barracuda being banned from human consumption. Another example of this is puffer fish poisoning, something that's common in Japan, where puffer fish is a traditional delicacy. And if it's not prepared correctly by a trained chef, the toxin can be digested by humans and can be deadly. Along the same lines, plants have their own toxins. So raw kidney beans is an example of this. They can have high levels they contain a toxin that is destroyed by heating and cooking, but eaten raw can be toxic. Similarly, certain mushrooms, herbs, and the pits of fruit all fall into this category. And lastly, we have physical hazards. So hair is the number one physical hazard that can be found in food, but this could also include glass, bone, metal, like from opening cans, bits of plastic, wood, fake fingernails, jewelry, a Band-Aid, any type of physical object that could come into contact with food and be accidentally ingested. There is one example where some people needed to have emergency surgery after accidentally ingesting food contaminated with a bristle from a wire brush that was used to clean a grill. So some individuals can develop foodborne illness without the presence of any of the previously mentioned biological, chemical, or physical hazards. A food allergy is an immune response to a specific protein within a food. And food allergies are increasingly common. The top 8 food allergies are wheat, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, soy, and milk. And food manufacturers are required to label any product that may contain any of these potential allergens. So allergies are for food intolerances, and a food allergy actually involves an immune response to a protein in the food, whereas a food intolerance is something a little bit different. This involves an inability to absorb or process a certain food because of an enzyme deficiency. So we can kind of see what this means with an example of dairy products. So if somebody had a food allergy to dairy, they would be allergic to casein, the protein in the milk. Whereas if they had lactose intolerance, they'd have the inability to digest the lactose in milk due to a deficiency in the lactase enzyme. So, food sensitivity is sort of a general umbrella term that encompasses any adverse reaction to components found in food, including the food allergies and food intolerances that we've just talked about. But it sometimes can be a little bit different. For example, people who react to MSG negatively with a headache or another negative symptom are considered to have a sensitivity to MSG, but this is not technically a food allergy or a food intolerance. So, as noted, food allergies do appear to be on the rise, but the best way to prevent an allergic reaction is to completely avoid the allergen. This is actually much more difficult than it might appear, just from that statement, even though the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act does require food manufacturers to appropriately label allergens. And this is because of cross contamination, which is the transfer of bacteria or other microorganism, or in this case, a food allergen from one food or surface to another. Um, so, so prevention of cross-contamination must be prevented and documented during storage, production, and cleaning procedures at any food manufacturer.